Alright then guys, welcome to the video, welcome back to the channel, and I thought today's video should be about things that I wish I'd known, or I guess things that I've learned modifying this car that I wish I knew when I first started modifying this car. I've owned this car for over 7 years now, and obviously over that period of time a lot of things have changed. This was an almost completely standard car when I bought it, and so I just thought I'd run through things that I wish I had known, little tidbits that I guess apply to modifying cars in general, but I suppose will also more focus on modifying one of these things, as this is the first car that I have modified this heavily. So if you're anything like me, this is potentially one of the first cars you are going to be modifying. Off the back of that, I think it's good to sort of figure out what you want from the car to then move forward with modifying it in the correct way for what you're after. So there's obviously lots of different ways you can modify one of these things, but I think the best way to go about it is to come up with some sort of build plan. I learned this from Dave at Motion Motorsport, where basically what you want to try and do is come up with all the parts that you want to do for a certain area. Although it's a really boring way of going about it, you want to buy all of them over a period of time and do them all at once. The benefit to doing that is that you end up saving money because you're not pulling the car apart multiple times, especially when it comes to suspension stuff. I've said this quite a few times in previous videos. So if you're going to do some coilovers, so you install the coilovers, go get an alignment, but then 2 months down the line you then like, oh actually I want to do some suspension bushes or something in the front lower control arms, for example, you then have to go get another alignment. So it makes more sense to be like, okay, so if I'm going to be doing coilovers, what around the coilovers can I replace at the same time, whether that's like drop links or any sort of ball joints, anything like that. So that's obviously just one example, but it sort of gives you an idea that it does make sense to try and block as many mods together in one go rather than just doing them one by one and ticking them off like that. It does obviously mean that the build is a slower build and you won't notice the difference of each part individually, and unless that is your target, it does make more sense financially if you are trying to save a bit of money long term with the build. Now that does also depend on whether you are planning on keeping the car or not. The reason I even got this car was that it was super practical, but yet it's still a super fun car to drive. So for me, I knew that I was going to be keeping this long term, and realistically I hope I never actually have to sell this car. So some of the decisions I've made with this are based around the fact that I am not thinking of actually selling the car in the future, which means I won't lose money on parts because I plan on keeping them, if you see what I mean. So if it is a car that you're only going to be in for like 1 or 2 years, in my opinion, I don't see the point in spending a load of money on mods to then sell the car in a couple of years and lose a load of money. But for me, I like trying to find out where the sweet spot is between modifying it and cost effectiveness. So I'm a big believer of the buy once, cry once mentality, which is that you skip out on buying cheap parts, because usually if you're buying it cheap, it means you've got to buy it twice because it will usually break or doesn't give you the performance that you're after. So with that in mind, I thought I would run through various things. Obviously, if you've got one of these, you're going to be wanting to changing a few bits up if you're looking to modify it. So the things you're going to want to do are obviously intake, inlet and exhaust. Those are the 3 main ones anyway. So I thought I'd break down various different price points to see where you fit, because the other thing to bear in mind is I've obviously modified this car to be a daily driver and to still be a good daily driver whilst being modified. So if you're not worried about that and you want to go for just all out 100% power, then there's obviously different ways you can go about things. The other thing as well is I like things carbon fiber, as you can probably tell from this car, so that also influenced some of my decisions as well. So it is totally up to you, with you modifying your own car, what you want to do. But this is obviously the route that I've taken. So when you're looking at intakes, I'd say you've probably got about 4 options to go for. You've either got the heat soaker, which quite a lot of cars seem to have, which is basically just an air filter that sits here right next to the engine, quite near the exhaust manifold, and so that is sucking in hot air. Not the best for power gains, but you do get the VTEC sound, and that's probably one of the cheapest ways you can get that VTEC sound. Personally for me, I don't think that's the right move, because if you're looking to map this car and get more power from it, sucking in that hot air means you're not going to get the same power you would get if you're getting a more cold air feed. On that, there is this Tegoa carbon fiber airbox option. For me, this ticks a lot of boxes, as I've said in plenty of other videos. I love carbon fiber, so it looks sick in the engine bay. It's obviously a cold air feed coming in above the bonnet up here, and it sounds amazing too. So for me, that kills 3 birds with 1 stone, and that's why I opted for this option. The other 2 options you've either got the long arm intake, which sits behind the bumper, which is actually what this car came with when I bought it. So that sits below the headlight. The only downside to that, I suppose, is if deep puddles or anything like that, it's a big risk for sucking up some water. And your other option, if you're going for all out power, is to do a battery relocation, get a scoop through your headlight and run a velocity stack intake with a cold air feed into a cone filter here, running straight into your throttle throttle body. Like I've said, that is the best option for all-out power. For me, that's not what I'm looking for with this car. I think that the Tegua induction kit encompasses all of the main things in one that I'm looking for, and so the potential loss of 3 or 4 horsepower is worth it for me for the practicality and the looks of the Tegua intake or the Grupp M intake if you want to go full JDM. Moving on from that, you then go into the throttle body, and personally, and I've been told by various tuners, that a throttle body doesn't actually matter for these cars unless you're going boosted. If you're staying NA like I am, I personally didn't see the need to a throttle body because it's just not pulling in enough air to actually warrant at the 250-ish, 260 horsepower range, and Remain from Racecow confirmed that. He said that it's not worth it, especially with the reliability issues you can have, and I've not had any issues with power because of it, so I guess that does prove it. If you are thinking of changing it, Skunk 2 offer one, Tegua do also offer one as well, and there's probably some others out there, but I've just never done any research into it because I know that it's not going to benefit me. If you are going boosted, then you are probably going to want a 70mm or maybe even bigger to get more air in. For me, it just wasn't worth it, and if you're thinking it from a budget point of view, it is a way to save some money as well. You then come into the inlet manifold, and again, there are quite a few options you can go for with this thing. As you can see, I've got the Skunk 2 Ultra inlet manifold. Now, this thing has actually gone up in price since I got it, so it doesn't quite match the pounds spent per horsepower that I would have got, but your options are you can either stay OEM, and I believe you can get about 230-ish horsepower with just the OEM inlet. Then there are various other OEM inlets that came on other K20s, RBC, RRC, things like that. Those are another option that if you want OEM Honda. It then jumps into the Skunk 2 Pro inlet, slightly different design to this. This is the Skunk 2 Ultra, which is probably the next price jump above that. And then if you're in full baller mode, then you can go for the Prackworks full carbon intake, and they look incredible. But I've heard that they don't make the most power, so it sort of depends on what you're going for. If you want the pure looks of it, because it does look incredible, then I would definitely recommend that. Moving on from that, you can go for dropping cams like I've done. You will need to do some bigger injectors. I've got the OEM Honda RDX injectors. I believe that the OEM injectors that come in the EP3 flow 320 cc's. These RDX ones are 410. I know you can get grams ones that are like 550 and things like that. I just went with the OEM because I knew that they'd be reliable. You have to have those for dropping cams. Now, I would say that dropping cams aren't fully worth it for the amount of money you spend. You're properly at the top end of how much pound you're spending for the horsepower. The only reason I did it was because if I was ever going to do it, it was when I was changing my exhaust system, which we will get onto. But if you are thinking of doing dropping cams, there are again a few options out there. You can do like Drag Cartel, the TDI cams. I've got the Skunk 2 dropping cams, which is probably the cheapest option of all of them. But like I said, the cams and injectors is a big chunk of money on top of it, so I wouldn't say it was an essential thing if you're just thinking of an NA car. I've basically gained 10 extra horsepower. It's up to you and your build whether you think it's worth it. And so moving on from the engine bay, we get to the exhaust. Now, this is obviously one of the first things you're probably going to want to change on the car anyway, and that's one of the first things I recommend changing because it does wake the car up and make it sound so much better. This is my second exhaust setup. If you've been following the channel for long enough, you'll know that I had a full spoon sports system, and that is, I suppose, one of my regrets about the build of this car is that that system was too small to be able to run the bigger power. Hence why I have now changed to the solid fab super silent 3-inch exhaust and the big bore manifold. Now, this is obviously, again, in the higher of the price ranges. These K20 engines love a 3-inch exhaust system, so that is what you're going to need if you want to get the most power out of your car. So in terms of exhaust setups that you can do, the lower price range I'd say would be like a Jap speed manifold into like an M2 exhaust system. Again, the M2 systems aren't a 3-inch system, so you're not going to get the most power from that. Also with the Jap speed manifold, I've heard of issues with the flexi, so I'd recommend doing some engine mounts and some gearbox mounts to at least help the flexi with engine movement and things like that, so it doesn't break too quickly. Your next step up, I suppose, would be like the Tegua manifold into the Tegua Miltech catback system. That's more of the mid-range sort of price. I've heard a lot of people running that and having great results. Or you can go for something like the solid fab system, the engineering that's gone into this exhaust system to get the best flow and scavenging effect from the engine to get those exhaust gases out in the most efficient way. It does mean that this system has been proven to run good numbers whilst also not being ridiculously loud. And then if you're not worried about price, you can go for something like the spoon system brand new. I know that that now is coming in at over $3,000 for the entire system, which is insane. Other things worth mentioning would be ECU choice. Now, there are multiple different options again out there for that, and those also vary in price as well. I've gone with what I assume is still the cheapest option, which is the Hondavert K-Pro ECU, which is basically a Hyundai to K-Pro V2. But the only downside to that is that there are mappers that don't actually want to map those ECUs, or you have to have a very specific version of K-Manager to be able to even map these without bricking them, because Hyundai are not happy happy about this product existing. So if you want less risk, I probably wouldn't recommend going for the Honda Vert. The second cheapest option, at this point in time I don't know prices, but there's a Doctronic ECU which has been used in Europe for a long time and has started popping up in the UK now. You've also got the Honda K100. This is a discontinued ECU, so you'll only be able to find those second hand, but those do come in at that lower price as well, and that is also what I have coming for the red EP3. The next step up from that is the K Pro V4, which loads of people run, and to be honest, it's quite overpriced for what it is. I think there's been another price hike on this as well. The only things you really benefit from over a K100 or a Honda Vert is you get Bluetooth, and especially over the K100, the K100 you can't plug in and do any file adjustments or anything like that. It is just the map gets loaded onto the ECU and then that's it done. Whereas with the K Pro, you do have the option to fiddle around with things if you so wish. And the next step up from that would be a standalone ECU, something like a Haltech Elite 1500, which realistically actually isn't that much more money than the K Pro V4 now. Considering you can just take that out of this car and put it into another car, actually may make more sense if you are thinking of switching out cars moving forward. Although it is slightly more expensive, the fact you don't have to buy another ECU for the next car you're going to get will actually save you money long term, and it does mean you can start running some of the cool accessories that Haltech sell, like the digital dash or something like that. So again, it does depend on what you're thinking of doing with the car and I suppose your end game. So I mentioned coilovers earlier, and it is something you want to take into consideration because I guess depending on your price point, depending on what sort of thing you can get for your money. So I'm running Yellow Speed Dynamic Pro Sport coilovers on this car, and I'd say they're probably on the same sort of equivalent level to like the BC Racing BR coilover. So it's not a super cheap budget option, but it's not crazy expensive. For me, they've been great. I've had them on the car for quite a few years now, and I haven't really had any major issues with them. And personally, I don't think it's worth actually going too much cheaper than this sort of level, because I feel like you start losing good ride quality, or it just becomes like a bouncy car, or parts can start breaking below this price point. The other good thing about Yellow Speed is parts are readily available. Same with BC Racing, I believe, as well. So if something does go wrong, you can get repairs. When you're talking about these lower end products that are obviously cheaper out the box, although it's saving you money short term, long term, you're probably going to end up replacing them sooner than something like this. Or if you're going for the higher price point with something like KW's suspension, I just think personally it's worth investing a bit more in coilovers. These are the things that connect you from the wheels and tires to the car. So if these aren't great, it can ruin the driving experience of this car, especially as these cars are such great handling cars. You don't really want to take away from that. Although there are cheaper options, I do think that this sort of price point and up is where I personally think it's best to be. It's totally up to you and your budget and what you want to do. If you just want to go for max low and you want to go Stancy Boy or something, it probably doesn't really matter what coilovers you go for. But for me, this is such a driver's car that I think it is worth investing and sort of saving that money to get a better part in this area. Obviously, again, this is my daily, so I didn't want something super aggressive. I wanted something that was going to be compliant, and tying that in with the Motion Motorsport fast road setup has made this car so much fun to drive. But realistically, these coilovers are obviously harsher than the standard suspension. It obviously also makes the car look cooler sitting lower as well. In terms of ride height, I don't actually know how much lower this car is than standard, because I just literally just said to Motion Motorsport, set it up however you want, I don't care what the ride height is. I think it's around 30 millimeters lower, and I do believe that if you want to go lower than that, you do have to start changing other suspension parts to be able to accommodate for that low car. I'm not totally sure what those are because I obviously haven't had to do it. That is another thing to look into. I think you need different steering arms and things like that. Could be wrong, not something I've looked into too much. So when it comes to wheels and tyres, I do think that it is again worth investing in a set of wheels that are a genuine wheel rather than a replica. And the reason I say that is because one, you're helping the industry because the company that actually created that wheel is getting the funds, but also the build quality is much better from these more premium wheel manufacturers. Now I understand that budget restraints do mean that some wheels are completely out of price bracket, hence why I don't have any Ray CE28s on this car. But for me, the Enkei RPF1 I think is a great wheel to get started with in genuine wheels. And the other thing to bear in mind is if you're looking at brand new sets of wheels, a replica set can set you back like 600, 700, 800 pounds for a full set brand new, when you could pick up some genuine wheels second hand. And that is exactly what I did with these Enkei RPF1s. I think I paid 730 pounds with tyres. And so even if you're looking at wheels at 500 pounds, I I personally would say it's worth saving up another £200 to then be able to get a second-hand set, as long as they're obviously in a good condition, because they are usually built better and will withstand more of these potholes that we seem to have popping up all over the place in this country. And on the second-hand part thing, I think that is a huge point that is worth making, because the amount of money I've saved on parts for this car because I bought them second-hand is crazy. So I would 100% recommend looking for second-hand stuff, or just being patient and waiting for the right thing to pop up. Someone will always be moving on from their EP3 to get into something else and be breaking a car that's got all the bits on it, and that is where so many of the parts on this car have come from. Again, it's about being patient and just waiting for the right thing to come up at a good price to be able to save yourself some money, but also to be able to get that part that you didn't think you'd be able to afford. So in terms of the specs that you're going to want to run for an EP3, which is something I took forever to figure out and is why I didn't end up with the wheels before I did the brakes, is a 17x8 ET of 35. Now that is not what these wheels are. These are an ET of 45, so I do have to run some spacers. Bearing that in mind though, you will have to roll your rear arches if you are running coilovers, because you will start rubbing the tyre on the inside of the arch at that width. But it does mean you get the perfect fitment. And whilst we're here, tyres are probably one of the most important things that you should consider when you're coming up with the build plan for your car, because obviously if you're planning to make it just a track car, you're obviously going to be buying pretty much just track tyres. So for me, I daily this car, as I've said plenty of times, and these Michelin Pilot Sport 5s are the top of the rung for a dailyable tyre that is great in the dry and in the wet. Obviously this is at the upper end of the price bracket, but for me, when it's the only thing that's connecting you to the road, I do believe it is worth spending the good money on tyres, and I would definitely recommend these Pilot Sport 5s. Now if you obviously don't have that kind of budget, the Uniroyal Rain Sport 5s, those are a great tyre. I had the Rain Sport 3s, I had 2 sets of Rain Sport 3s, so I was really happy with those before switching to these. There are plenty of tyres out there, loads of different price points, and then depending on what you're wanting to do with the car will depend on which tyre you go for as well. Now something that I completely didn't consider when I first got this car, because I, one, didn't have the knowledge, and two, it wasn't as much of a problem 7 years ago, is the rust of these things. Now I've mentioned this in so many different videos, but it really is important for moving forward now on what you're doing with one of these cars, because getting the rust repaired on this could be crucial to whether you even save the car or not, because these are rusting out so bad that so many of them are just becoming MOT write-offs. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you'd have seen that this car isn't too bad, but it is at the point where it does need saving now, otherwise it's going to cost far more in the future to get it sorted. I do think, however, that in the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of these cars are not going to be around anymore because people just don't have the funds to be able to save them from the rust they do incur. If you are looking to save the car, you can do what I am going to be doing in the future, which is take it to Motion Motorsport and get them to fully fix all the rust and get it undersealed and everything. But if that is not an option for you because of budget, Motion Motorsport also make kits that you can buy to be able to weld in new panels, because these are super common for rusting on the rear wheel arches, down here, along the sills, and various other spots underneath the car. And it is worth checking, if you haven't even bought the car yet, checking in these areas as well as behind the speakers. I have full videos on all of these if you do want more info, so go check that out on the channel. But it is definitely something that I got very lucky with this car, because it was something I didn't look at all. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to check the rust on the car that you have or are planning on getting, as well as factoring that into your build, because there is no way of you actually escaping it apart from getting it sorted. And so with all these things, the point I'm trying to get across is that I guess I'm trying to save you guys as much money as possible when building your car, because that is something I've tried to do by doing various bits of research and finding out which bits are best for me personally. But that does lead to the things I wish I had done personally that I ended up changing, and obviously cost me more money in the long term. I guess the first and major one, which I've already mentioned, is the exhaust system on this car. Having to switch up the exhaust system was probably one of the most expensive mistakes that I made when building this car, just because of my lack of knowledge on getting power from these cars. At the time, I just wanted the spoon exhaust. It was cool to have genuine spoon parts on the car, and I didn't realize how much that would hurt me power-wise until I did end up getting the car matte. So the downside from my point of view is, one, I had paid for an exhaust that wasn't getting the most power, and two, it then meant I had to get a full remap to be able to take advantage of getting a new exhaust. So not only did I have to buy a new exhaust, I'd have to get the car mapped again, so that's like double cost. So that's probably the biggest mistake, but I do have a list on my phone of things that I wish that I'd done the first time that I ended up having to change. So quite a major one, and one that was very expensive, which was from my first ever video on this car, was when I was doing the suspension. The front lower control arms on this were an absolute nightmare to get the ball joints out of, as well as the bushes, and that cost me so much money in labour, and it would have been far cheaper for me to buy either powder coated or just fully refurbished front lower control arms, or even just front lower control arms that already had the bushes in them. Another thing I wish I'd got, which I think just looks a lot nicer and would have just refreshed the underside of the car a bit more, is I wish I'd done like a powder coated subframe. I guess that's not really an essential thing, and I still haven't got a powder coated subframe, so it's not like I've actually gone out and done that. But I think when you're pulling your car apart, if you're having to take the subframe off to change a clutch or something, I think it's worth putting something like that back on. Just sort of refreshes the underside and at least replace all the bushes in that as well, so you're not putting old stuff back on. Again, that sort of ties in with, obviously, when you drop the subframe, you have to get an alignment. Now this one is interesting because I don't know if it's actually an issue for me anymore, but I wish I had bought the JDM front anti-roll bar rather than buying the Progress front anti-roll bar, because I couldn't fit the spoon exhaust system. Now there is a chance, I believe, that my Progress front anti-roll bar would actually fit the big bore manifold from Solid Fab, so I'm kind of tempted to see if that's possible, as it may not be super annoying to do with all the V-bands on this exhaust. So let me know down below if you want to see that in the future. It was something I did have to purchase just to be able to run the spoon manifold, but if you're planning on not running this JDM design manifold and you are planning on just getting this big bore manifold, or potentially just the normal Solid Fab manifold, again, it's something that isn't super essential, but it's just a thicker anti-roll bar. And this is something that I alluded to earlier, and that is knowing the wheel specs before buying any sort of brakes or anything. So my original plan was, when I got these brakes, I was going to run spacers and the OEM wheels. Now I ended up ordering 15mm spacers and they weren't big enough. You need 20mm spacers if you want to run standard wheels. Now that is a massive spacer and something I personally wouldn't recommend doing. So luckily for me, Hasek Garage EP3 had a couple of Team Dynamic wheels that did clear the brakes that I could run until I sorted out wheels, which I ended up also buying from him in the future, which were these Enki RPF ones. And even these Enki RPF ones don't quite fit because I've got a 5mm spacer in the front to clear these DC5 calipers. Knowing what I know now, the best way around would be to get the wheels and then the brakes should fit underneath wheels with the right spec. If you are looking for an OEM wheel that are those specs, and it's maybe why you see so many EP3s with them, and I've mentioned this plenty of times before as well, the Evo 8 Enkis are a super popular wheel that people run on EP3s because they are that exact spec. They are the 17x8 ET of 35 that fit these cars so perfectly. A quick little fun one is, when you're installing your spoon mirror glass, try not to snap it like I did. Otherwise you have to buy another one because it's completely unusable. Another major one was when I did install the coilovers, because this car was the first car I ever installed coilovers on. I had no idea what I was doing, and I did buy them brand new, so the spec that they were in the box was actually probably perfect, and I shouldn't have adjusted them, because when I first got it, I got it all aligned and everything, but the car was so low, it was almost undrivable, so I ended up having to then pay for another alignment, which was very annoying. If you're buying coilovers brand new, I would recommend just installing them at the height they are out of the box. Actually, if you're buying them second hand and you've seen the car they've come off, you probably know what height they're going to be anyway. That did screw me over, but it's just because of my lack of knowledge. I'd like never done coilovers before. I just thought you'd have to adjust it to the right height before installing them, and you probably see in the video from all those years ago of how low it did actually sit before I actually got it sorted properly. Another quick one, but another one that does seem to pop up quite a lot, is the Heyco wind deflectors are terrible for the EP3. Although these Climair ones are more expensive, they are fully worth it. I have not had any problems ever since I got them, and I've had them on the car a few years now, whereas I went through 2 sets of Heyco ones before I even found out about these Climair ones. So if you're not willing to spend the money on the JDM wind deflectors, these Climair ones are definitely the move. So this is something I haven't actually done, but I probably would recommend it, is to do the Buddy Club or the Revo short shifter. Now they're not super expensive, I think they're about £120 or something like that, but that will just tighten up the feel of the gear stick, and it is something I'm potentially going to do in the future. I know that Hybrid Racing offer a shifter as well, but I have heard issues of gear selection problems based on the adjustment on those, but I have driven a couple of cars that have got that shifter in and it does feel amazing. So I do think that the sweet spot could potentially be those short shifters from Buddy Club or Revo, because they're a lot cheaper and they just fully replace the OEM unit, so you don't get as much shake and wobble. As it is such a major touch point in the car, it is probably worth doing, and it is potentially something I'm going to do in the not too distant future. So let me know down below if you think I should, because at the moment all I have in there is the MJC short shifter, which is the same as the Tegra short shifter, and that's the only shifter upgrade I've got inside the car. Obviously I've got the Acuity bushes on the shifter cables themselves. Let me know if you think those are worth picking up, because I haven't actually driven or felt a car that's got one. And that is my full list of things I wish I'd done differently. There isn't actually much that I would change on how I've built this car, because I've spent so long doing it that I haven't felt rushed, and I feel like I've made the right choices for me on pretty much everything apart from that list I've just listed to you. And I think that is the major benefit of taking your time with this sort of thing, especially if it's a car you're going to keep like I am. And so there we go, guys. Hopefully this video has been been useful for you, because I know that it certainly would have been useful for me 7 years ago, having that sort of information, and what I know now would have been very useful back then, because I probably wouldn't have made as many of those small mistakes as I did. Hopefully this can give you more of an idea of what you want to do with your car and your build moving forward. But let me know down below if this has been useful for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this with this car, the S2000, and for features in the future as well. Don't forget to like this one, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.